Welcome back to Gray and Gritty. My name is LJ Winnefeld.
And I am Sandy Winnefeld, otherwise known as the Gray.
And it's been a couple of weeks. We've been very, very busy with a bunch of different things, travel all across the country. So we did take a couple of weeks off from the podcast, and our writing tempo has slowed down just a little bit, but we're going to be getting back into it as we get through the rest of this month and into March. But I would be remiss, Dad, if I did not congratulate you on your award that you received from Georgia Tech last night. And I was fortunate enough to be in Atlanta with you when you received it. Tell us a little bit about the award.
Well, Georgia Tech gives 5 awards annually to alumni and other people. And I was very surprised and fortunate to learn that I was going to be the recipient of the Community Service Award. And, that was a really neat experience. There's probably 400 or 500 people in the room, and they were all lovers of Georgia Tech, as I am. But the really cool thing for me was the young students the ambassadors, who introduced each of the awardees. Boy, if you've got not much faith in the youth of America, you should see these people. They were incredibly polished as they made their introductions. So it was really delightful for me to see that.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway from me was these 23, 24-year-olds getting up in front of a room of 500 plus people. All of these people in this room have been incredibly successful, successful alumni of Georgia Tech. So it could be a fascinating thing. And I think that what I found was most impressive was the fact that not only did they deliver a speech in front of this entire room, but none of them had a script, a speech, or a teleprompter. They all just delivered it off the cuff. It's obvious that they were well rehearsed and practiced. And I think it's just a testament, not just to the youth of America, but I think more specifically the caliber of individual that comes out of Georgia Tech and that Georgia Tech's producing today. So it was really special.
Yep.
Awesome.
I'd like to say that I could get into Georgia Tech right now, but I'm not sure I could.
Awesome. So I'm going to pull up our topic. I'll cut this. So we're going to jump into our topics today. We've got a wide range of different topics. We're going to start with a rehash of our conversation about Iran. We're going to dive into a recent military shakeup within the Chinese military, and then talk a little bit about the end of the New START treaty. That's the nuclear treaty between the United States and Russia. And then we'll do a quick speed round, Dad, at the end. I want to talk briefly about the collision that just happened between 2 Navy ships in the Caribbean. And then there was one other one. Dang. There was one other topic. I'm going to do this over again. I had it. It was the collision of the 2 ships, and then there was something else that happened recently. Oh, yeah. Okay. I'll cut all this and we'll go back in. So we've got a broad range of topics that we're going to talk about today. The first one is going to be on Iran, a rehash of something that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Then we'll jump into a recent shakeup in the Chinese military. And then we'll talk about the end of the New START treaty, which is the nuclear treaty between the United States and Russia that recently came to an end. And I know, Dad, you had a little bit to do with that back when it was initially negotiated. And then we'll do a speed round at the end, because I'd like to talk a little bit about the 2 Navy ships that collided in the Caribbean, as well as this drone airspace closure thing that happened in Texas, just to get some really initial thoughts on that. But first, we'll jump into Iran. We mentioned the protests that were happening in Iran a few weeks ago, but I felt that this was worth revisiting. I know you felt the same way, Dad. A quick summary for those that didn't listen to the previous podcast or haven't really been paying attention to the protests that have been happening over there. Since late December, Iran has been hit by a wave of new national protests. What started as anger over the cost of living and economic instability has morphed into something much bigger. It's really public fury at the system itself, with calls for an end to clerical rule. The regime has responded with brute force. Security forces have flooded the streets, arrests have spiked, and in early January, the government imposed a sweeping internet shutdown. A little more on that later. And this really signals that the regime thinks that this could be a potential existential threat. When they shut down the internet, that means that they're taking this seriously. What this does mean, though, is since there's no internet and there's little way to communicate, is that the number of casualties that have happened, because usually when this happens, Iran uses lethal force. Unlike in the United States, Iran uses lethal force against protests. It becomes very hard to determine how many casualties have resulted from these protests. I've seen wide varieties of numbers, all the way from 10 to 50, all the way up to 90,000. Again, these are all unconfirmed reports. But if the number was up to 90,000, that would be truly significant and one of the most bloody protests that the regime has ever seen. And while all of this is happening, the United States and Iran have begun talks on a potential new nuclear deal. And just to remind everybody, the first Trump administration tore up the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, which was the original nuclear deal negotiated under Obama over a decade ago. And now we're kind of working through this process of what a new nuclear deal would look like. A lot of questions for you on this, Dad. I think that this situation has evolved quite a bit since we last talked about it a few weeks ago. But the first thing, can you just walk us through the intelligence picture and what it looks like? With the internet blackout, how do we actually know what is happening in Iran?
Yeah, so I haven't seen the actual intelligence myself because I still have my clearance, but I do other things with that. But I will say, intelligence doesn't necessarily depend on the internet. Obviously, you can open source like the internet. You can get a pretty good glimpse for what's going on the ground, how many casualties, the status of the protests, and the like. But we have an awful lot of other sources that we can use, which obviously we can't get into because they're intelligence sources and methods. But our folks probably have a pretty good sight picture for what's going on the ground. And I would note that we saw a news report the other day that there were some Starlink terminals that were smuggled into Iran. Now, that's not going to help the protesters organize themselves, which they might be able to do on social media, on the internet, but it certainly helps some people in Iran get the information out of the country on what's really going on. So I have a pretty high level of confidence that we've got a pretty decent picture of what's going on. And I would also say we've got some great partner countries who have very good intelligence also on what's going inside Iran.
Reading that Wall Street Journal article about them smuggling, these Starlink devices into the country made me think that we've permeated, at least our intelligence agencies have permeated into Iran, and that we actually have a pretty good presence. I know that the Mossad does, and Israeli intelligence has definitely really penetrated into Iran. So I do think that there are other options or other ways to figure out exactly what's happening. I do find it a little bit surprising that the number of casualties is so wide in its variance, right? They've got reports of 20,000 all the way up to 90,000, which is a significant number. 20,000 is still a lot of people, not to say that it isn't, but it's very different than if you're getting close to, six figures of civilians killed by their regime.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because what an authoritarian regime probably fears the most is its own people. And the way it controls that fear of its people is by controlling the information that the people get. So they're terrified of things like Starlink. Russia, China, Iran, they really dislike not having control of the information that's flowing in and out of their country.
Do you think that's what keeps the regime up at night? Is their people, or is it more of a concern that, like they saw earlier, that Israel or the United States is going to conduct a targeted strike? Which do you think, they're more concerned about at this point?
Yeah, by the way, I love the term targeted strike because I've never heard of anything called an untargeted strike. So they're always targeted. Yeah. But the regime is...
Well, maybe unless you're Russian artillery and you're just trying to fill a grid square, but yeah.
There you go. Good point. But the regime's in a terrible place. They were humiliated in the last year through the essential destruction of Hamas and Hezbollah and of very weakened Houthis, including the strikes that we all know occurred against Iranian nuclear targets in June. They did this sort of token strike that they announced well in advance back onto Qatar so that they could show images to their own people. But of course, they were very careful not to actually hit anything because they didn't want to provoke a big response for us. Now, they just had this big upheaval you described. It was economically based. It was not ideology based or anything like that. It was about economics. And as you mentioned, they had to literally murder over 10,000 of their people. And now they're being threatened with these strikes. Now, one thing to remember, the Iranians invented chess. They are very skilled and tough negotiators. And while I don't think they have much of an appetite for another convulsion like we saw in June, they will play this very close to the line. And we have to remember that the Ayatollah and the entire regime and the revolution are based on two things: death to America and death to Israel. And none of that has changed. They're very hard over on that. But the people, and in particularly the mid-level merchants who have so much power in Iran, are the ones that the regime is very much afraid of.
Tell me a little bit more about those mid-level merchants. I haven't really heard anybody talk about that because it's always been about the IRGC or the clerics or the religious leadership, but that's a new angle that I haven't really heard much about.
They're called. I'll be very brief. They're called the Bazaris. They are the merchants that basically bring products to market in Iran. You don't find big WalMarts and superstores in Iran. Pretty much everything that people buy comes from one of these mid-level merchants, and they have an enormous amount of power and influence over the government, and the government takes them very, very seriously.
Microphone was muted. Yeah, I'm good. I caught everything. So one of the big things, though, whenever we enter into high-level strategic talks or we are talking about strikes, the biggest thing that always comes to my mind is what would success look like here at the end of all this? I mean, is success regime change? Is it a new nuclear deal? Is it no change from the status quo right now, but the protests and the killing of civilians have stopped? What is your thoughts on what success would look like?
Yeah, so LJ, I think the threshold for U.S. success, something that has to happen, would probably be some kind of Iranian concessions on their nuclear program. Not only the same kind of things that we saw in the vaunted JCPOA, which you mentioned at the opening, but also actually giving up their already highly enriched uranium, whatever's left after the strikes, and some kind of an agreement on future enrichment and monitoring, which is ironically exactly what we had under the agreement Torp in his first term. So the only thing that would be different is maybe actually getting our hands on 400 kilograms or so of highly enriched uranium, which the Iranians have hinted is something they would put on the table. But beyond that, the Trump administration would love to have limitations on Iranian ballistic missiles, but that's going to be extremely hard to happen and even harder to enforce. And we have to remember that Iran has lost a couple of its major bargaining chips or major threats that it can hold in the region, namely Hezbollah and the Houthis and Hamas. And it's going to cling to anything it can to threaten Israel. And the only thing they can threaten Israel with right now is ballistic missiles. So it's going to be very hard to get them to give those up. We've also expressed we want them to agree to not support their proxies. That will never happen. I do not think that success either is aimed to include or will include actual regime change. This administration does not seem to care whether nations have oppressive, undemocratic governments or not. There's always a deeper cause, a deeper reason for what they're doing, as we've seen in Venezuela, where they're not pushing hard for actual regime change. The dissidents have been badly wounded by Iran's crackdown that you talked about, and they don't seem to be willing to jump back into the streets just because the U.S. bombs targets in Iran. And there's really no charismatic, safe leader that vast numbers of Iranians will embrace, just waiting on the sidelines and who can survive the IRGC, for example, maintaining its power. So I think the best we can look for is some kind of renewed nuclear deal. We all know that President Trump will make massive threats, and then as long as he gets something, he will generally change the subject and move on to something else. And that may well be what happens here. But
I agree.
It may be that he has put so much out there on the line and that Iran is so difficult to negotiate with, even over their nuclear program, that he may actually strike.
Yeah, well, I think that even if he strikes, though, that's not regime change, as we've discussed before. I think people talk about Venezuela, oh, Maduro is gone. That's regime change. It's not regime change. It's just you've removed the leader. The regime is still in place. The oppressive government is still doing what it's going to do. And the same thing would happen in Iran. If we talk regime change, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I think that regime change would not be a success for the United States because of the requirements it would take to get there. And I mean, if the United States was not involved at all, regime change is not possible. I think I'm pretty confident and stand on firm ground when I say that regime change in Iran without U.S. involvement is impossible. I mean, strong boots on the ground kind of involvement.
Yeah,
And
and
so
you
I
have to
think
ask
that
what
if,
comes next. Who is
yeah,
the regime going to change to? It'd probably be somebody just as bad.
exactly. And what that means is it means, American blood and American treasure on the line being spent for something like this that we may not necessarily have to have. I agree with you. I think that, monitoring, getting back to a JCPOA definitely would be a success story. For me, the number one thing that would be a success story, I could put all that other stuff aside, but getting the nuclear enriched material that was moved from those facilities prior to the strikes would be at the very top of my list if I was in the negotiation room with the Iranians. But on that point, when you walk into a negotiation, you have to bring something to the table as well. Because the Iranians, unless it's just, hey, we'll give you the nuclear material as long as you don't strike our leaders, I don't think that is how this negotiation is going to go. What will the United States bring to the table? Will it be sanctions relief? Will it be guarantees to not mess with their population? Will it be guarantees to maybe try to hold Israel back? What would that look like coming from the United States side of the table?
Well, you would think in most negotiations you would have carrots and sticks. Clearly, I think that the dominant negotiation tactic in this particular idea is sticks. In other words, we will not strike you if you give us this deal. Will there be some kind of a carrot? There might be some sort of symbolic carrot that's small that the Iranian leadership can point to for its people, like some minor sanctions relief, or releasing their ability to sell oil more broadly, that kind of thing. But I think it's mostly going to be the release of the stick rather than the offering of a carrot here.
So that leads me to my next question. Is the Iranian regime one that is going to respond favorably to only sticks? Because it seems like to me they are very much defensive in nature and they feel like that they can withstand multiple sticks unless it's U.S. boots on the ground, which I think they know that we're not going to do. Do you think that they would be responsive to something like this?
I think they are probably going to be responsive on the nuclear side. And they'll try to get themselves back into the same deal they had before because the regime maintained power, and they really didn't lose that much under the old JICPOA. So they'll be looking for that, and they're going to work very hard to make sure that's all they have to give.
Two more questions on Iran before we move to China. The first one. What do you think Israel is thinking of all this? Because that's obvious. Anytime you talk about Iran, I feel like you probably need to talk about the Arab states as well. But you absolutely need to keep Israel in the back of your mind. What do you think Israel, would JCPOA be seen as a win? JCPOA round two be seen as a win for Israel? Or is it like, no, we don't want them to have any kind of nuclear enrichment capability?
Yeah, well, we know that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with President Trump just the other day. Mm-hmm. And what came out of that was exactly what has always come out of a meeting between Netanyahu and a president on this topic, and that is Israel bitterly dislikes negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. Unless, some kind of negotiation yielded a complete end with total inspections and the like, which is not going to ever happen. And Netanyahu made this very clear to Trump, and Trump pushed back on him and said, no, we would very much prefer to have an agreement than to go back into combat against Iran. Israel has always wanted to completely destroy and remove and eliminate that program. And, it's hard not to understand why they feel that way. They're the ones who are the supposed target of a potential Iranian nuclear weapon, and they don't want to take any chances whatsoever, based on their history, that could happen. So they do not like these negotiations one bit.
Yeah. And final question on Iran. Well, I asked you, I think 2-3 weeks ago, if you thought that strikes into Iran were a good idea. I think that you said that you would support them if they were done well, and I said absolutely not. Do you still stick with that, or are you changing your mind?
I think, if the Iranians prove to be completely recalcitrant in this negotiation, this is an opportunity right here where the threat is out there. And if they don't respond with some sort of serious negotiation on their nuclear program, I think that if you did strikes the right way, you might be able to compel them to the table. There are lots of questions about that, though, and including what is the right way, what are the right targets, and how much do you do, and for how long, and what is the legal basis, which is very hard to find for those kinds of strikes. But sweeping all that aside, because as we've seen, the sort of three great powers in the world are usually are now using rule of power, not rule of law. So I would support it under the right circumstances, but I haven't seen the right circumstances yet.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because the second carrier strike group has been ordered to that region of the world. So we'll see. I mean, you jump onto Kalshi or Polymarket, and the odds for the Ayatollah being removed from power before the end of the year are really climbing. It was perceived this summer it might happen or before the summer, but now I think by the end of the year the odds were up around 40%, which is obviously less than 50, but still much higher than they were earlier when these protests first started.
Yeah, one of the great things about a carrier strike group, probably more than almost any other asset the U.S. military has, is its usefulness in diplomacy. It's a very meaningful, strong signal, and not to dismiss the impressive power from, let's say, an F-15E squadron that you might send to the UAE or Qatar or some other regional partner. That doesn't sound quite as big as the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group has been, told to deploy to the area, and people think, wow, that's a really big deal. So that is a signal to Iran as much as anything. And of course, if you have to strike, it's always better to have two carriers rather than one.
Well, and there's a lot of precedent too, because we moved a ton of military equipment and a carrier strike group and a whole Marine expeditionary unit off of the coast of Venezuela, and they sat there for a long time before they did anything, but it eventually led to Maduro being removed and a bunch of strikes happening in Venezuela. So I think it's not just we have this big stick, are we going to use it or not? It's like, no, we literally just used it a couple of months ago, so don't mess with us. And I think it's a great point.
It'll take a while to get that carrier strike group there, even though they're very strategically mobile. But there's also a horizon for negotiations. It's not like this, today or else for Iran. There are active negotiations going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a good point, too. The strategic mobility, even though these things can move very quickly, you're talking about strategic long-range movements to get that kind of combat power in a different part of the world. It takes a while, but we're still better and faster at it than any other nation. Well, let's move on to our second topic on China, where something pretty extraordinary is happening inside the country's military leadership. Xi Jinping is executing the most aggressive shakeup of the Central Military Commission, or the CMC, that we've seen in decades. And the CMC is the CCP's top command body that controls the People's Liberation Army. It consists of a chairman, which is Xi himself, and then a bunch of vice chairmen and various other members. Over the course of the last few months, Xi has systematically removed all but one of the vice chairmen within the CMC. Now, a lot of these have been due to corruption charges or other investigations, but the biggest one that recently happened, and the reason why I wanted to talk with this, Dad, is he just removed another vice chairman who was, and this vice chairman's father and Xi's father were boyhood friends, one might say, in the past, and he removed him not based off of corruption charges, but based off of essentially trampling on the chairman's duty to lead the country and to lead the CMC, which is notably different, which means that this vice chairman of the CMC must have done something to piss Xi off or maybe even challenged his authority within the CMC. This is really staggeringly unprecedented in my opinion, because now you have essentially Xi is the sole leader of the largest military on the planet, with the other vice chairman really just being an anti-corruption individual with very little power. I got a wide range of questions here for you, Dad, but really the biggest one is this seems unprecedented, But have you ever seen a purge of senior military leadership in China at this scale? And what do you think that that really means is happening inside of the Chinese military?
Well, first of all, I think we have to be very, very careful about mirror imaging here. Um, we've talked about what six military officers, senior military officers, being purged basically by Xi Jinping. Look what's happened in the United States in the last year. We had a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a chief of naval operations, a chief of the Coast Guard, a vice chief of the Air Force, and a combatant commander. Basically, get purged. So we are not China is not the only people in the world who or only country in the world who has this happen. Now it probably feels a little differently if you are the vice chairman of the military committee and you get purged in China, because you're probably going to jail on some kind of trumped up charges, or perhaps real charges if there really was corruption there. And we know that purges are nothing new in any totalitarian state. The leader of that state, if you read a book called How to Be a Dictator, generally one of the ways they maintain power is by creating divisions among their underlings so they compete with each other rather than threaten the leader. And so this is one way of doing that. And perhaps if one of the underlings gets a little bit feisty, there's an easy mechanism to send them away. And that's probably what's happening here.
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest reasons why this happened, with this guy, this vice chairman, one of seven, right, that was recently removed, who I said, had a close relationship with Xi. I think part of the reason why it may happen, and I'm totally speculating here, is because everybody else had been, and he started to accumulate more power. And to your point, any kind of challenge to a dictator's authority could be perceived as a sign of weakness. And I think this was a way to kind of flush that out. Now the point of
I was going to say that nepotism in an authoritarian system, and I don't necessarily mean familial nepotism. I also mean historical friendship nepotism, is very, very useful to somebody to get into a position of power until it's not. And the one thing that trumps all of that is loyalty to the leader, potentially threatening the leader, and the leader needing to remain absolutely 100% secure. And we see this in Russia from time to time, and the Russian defense minister was fired a year or so ago, Shoigu. So that's a classic action by an authoritarian regime, which is, again, we have to look in the mirror on this.
Absolutely. To the point of chiefs of staff, CNO, multiple different senior military leaders within, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs being removed from power here. I do think that, there's maybe some mirror effect, and it has absolutely happened here in an unprecedented way. No matter what side of the aisle you fall on, and obviously you and me squarely in the middle, it was very, very abnormal. And it is within the dictator, handbook to remove military leaders when they come into power and replace them with other people. Now, what I'd say is I'm not going to go nearly as far as to necessarily draw a close comparison to what just happened in China to what has happened in our own military, because I do believe that there is a lot more transparency with our military than there is with what's happening over in the CCP. I mean, it is effectively a black hole. It's opaque. And it was largely probably done because there were direct confrontations to Xi's power.
Yeah.
This may have been more related to DEI and all that.
Yeah, exactly. Let's be clear that the U.S. Purge, as it were, was not about military leaders threatening in any way, shape, or form the president. We just don't do that as a military. Mm-hmm. But it was clearly dislike of perception of DEI and a desire for change, and it's certainly the president's prerogative to do that. But we did lose an awful lot of senior leaders.
Well, and the difference here too, as you often point out, is a lot of those senior military leaders went off into retirement, and they're off doing other things. I don't know where Lisa Franchetti, Admiral Franchetti's working now, but she's not in prison. She's not in jail. Where when senior military leaders are removed because the leader may not like them or may not want them in a position of power, typically they end up either dead or in prison. And so there's another big difference. But really, one of the biggest things that I wanted to talk to you about, Dad, does this mean for Taiwan? Because I have read a wide range of things that have said, well, this may delay a Taiwan invasion. This may hinder one if they do decide to go with it, or it may completely free and open up Xi to do it whenever he wants. And that may have been the reason why he was purging his CMC, because some of them may have been pushing back on the timeline that Xi wanted to make a Taiwan invasion. What are your thoughts with this purge as it relates to Taiwan?
Yeah, so I don't know that it changes very much. I think there are much bigger muscle movements that are dictating whether and when Xi Jinping will move, and how, by the way, how Xi Jinping will move against Taiwan. We just know that he will. We just don't know how or when. And I'm not so sure that these senior guys really had that much to do, frankly, with the proficiency and the capability of the People's Liberation Army, Navy, Air Force, and so on. The timing of this is going to depend a lot more on when the 21st Party Congress is. It will depend on whether China's military is ready, whether Taiwan's military is ready to resist. It will have to do with political events such as the Olympics in 2028 and the like. So I tend to sort of brush this aside. The new people who come in will be charged with making sure that PLA is ready when it needs to be ready. But I don't think this either hastens or delays that move.
I think to that point, if you were to remove the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff from the United States military, whether the leader did it or heaven forbid something happened to them, I don't think that it seriously inhibits our ability to fight as a nation or accomplish our strategic military or even tactical military objectives. The training and the good order and discipline of the Chinese military, the PLA, is one of the most capable militaries in the world. I don't think hinges on senior leaders. You talk about strategic level stuff and large strategic level decisions, yeah, but I don't think that it would affect their ability to do it. And I think I agree with your point. I don't think that it's necessarily going to be a contributing factor as to when Xi, even if Xi decides to cross the strait.
Yeah, so with that in mind, we can take a little bit of a sidebar here. There are basically 6 things you have to have if you're going to have a really, really good military. The first one is will. Your soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, National Guardsmen have to know why they're doing what they're doing, and they have to believe in it. You have to have skill. They have to actually be well trained and with good doctrine and the like. You have to have culture. And we are blessed in our country with a non-commissioned officer culture, which tends to not exist in these authoritarian militaries. And it's a massive advantage for the United States and our Western counterparts in that regard. You have to have technology. You have to have mass. And then you have to have good logistics. And if you look to Russia, they really only had about 1.5 of those things at the beginning of their war with Ukraine. They had a lot of mass, and they had some technology, but they didn't have will, skill, culture, and they certainly didn't have very good logistics. So the question then is, where does China stand in that? And it's a very difficult, some of those characteristics are very hard to assess from an intelligence perspective. So we don't really necessarily have 100% confidence in our understanding of how good the Chinese military really is.
And I could be wrong in this assessment, but my understanding is that China is kind of, like I said earlier, it's kind of like a black hole. It's a black pit of information because it's hard to get human source intelligence out of China. All of the stuff you're relying on is either OSINT or other means from outside of China trying to collect information, and that definitely goes with respect to its military. There's a CIA video that was just released lately it's gone viral in America, so I don't know how effective it was at actually reaching into China, but it basically depicts this disgruntled mid-level CCP or People's Liberation Army officer saying, I'm seeing all these people above me get removed from office who I thought were competent because my corrupt dictator doesn't like them. And I want to make sure my homeland is defended. Okay, so I'm going to go give information to the United States government, and all that. So I don't know how effective it was in China, but I can tell you it ripped through the social media circles within the United States military and some of my friend groups. And it was powerful for me, but if it's powerful for me, it may not necessarily be powerful for someone in a different culture like China. But yeah, it seems like China is just a black pit that we don't really understand. And some of those things like will are sometimes hard to judge until you actually step off and start conducting those operations, depending on what the operation is. Because I can tell you, even here in the United States, the will is going to be there for a lot of things, but there are some things that the military could be asked to do where it's like, okay, where does this fall in defending the Constitution, right? You saw some of that in Iraq, especially towards the end. But yeah, I agree. I think that it's very hard to determine those 6 factors with the Chinese military.
Yep, absolutely.
But we can jump in. You mentioned Russia. We can jump into our third and final major topic, and then we'll do a quick speed round here at the end. But our third topic is one that really did not generate a ton of headlines, but it's arguably one of the most consequential things that's happened in the last week or so. On February 5th, the New START treaty, the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty between the United States and Russia, expired. And with it, we've entered into relatively uncharted territory, talking about prior to this century and really kind of early Cold War days. For 15 years, New START put hard, verifiable limits on the world's 2 largest nuclear arsenals. We're talking about caps of 1,500 deployable strategic warheads and 700 deployed delivery systems per side. But this is about more than just the numbers. It created a verification system, on-site inspections, data exchanges, notifications when missiles would be moved, and the transparency that comes from that verification system is really what I think was most important. With that gone, we enter into what the UN Secretary General has called a grave moment, again, because for the first time in more than 50 years, there are no binding limits on the U.S. and Russian strategic nuclear forces. Russia had offered a 1-year voluntary extension of the treaty, basically saying, let's continue to follow the rules while we negotiate something new. But President Trump rejected that, saying that he wanted a new, more modern deal that involved China as well. Dad, I remember back when I was in middle school, you went over to Moscow. You were a part of these New START deliberations and talks. I remember that dominating a pretty significant chunk of your time, I think when you were the J5. Can you tell me a little bit about the New START treaty? Break it down for us. What was it? Why was it important? Things like that.
Yeah, so it was a very interesting time, first of all, and where we had a long, torturous negotiation with the Russians. And as you know, the Russians tend to be very paranoid. They mirror image on us. If they're looking for ways to do some sort of sneaky circumvention of a treaty that they would probably do, then they would believe that we would do the same thing, which of course we wouldn't. That's not the way we operate. We had a great team. It was led by Rose Gottmuller, who was his long history in the State Department with RAND Corporation, a Russian speaker, a gifted negotiator, and a wonderful friend. She led that forward team in the negotiations, and I was part of the team that we had back in Washington, D.C., that was sort of the rear guard, as it were, when there was a question or a negotiating point where they needed guidance. They would send it back to us. We would talk about it in the White House Situation Room, if necessary, get the president's approval, and then we would send that guidance back out. As a side note, it was a very interesting cultural difference between us and the Russians, where we were able to, because of our IT technology and our decision-making apparatus, we were able to get answers to those kinds of questions very, very quickly back to our team. Whereas on the Russian side, they had a much more cumbersome bureaucratic system to get questions answered, and it took them a lot longer. And so we had to be very careful not to do what you call negotiating against yourself, where we would go, gee, they haven't answered us yet. Maybe we need to sweeten our proposal back. It's like, no, they're just slow. Let's wait and see what they come back with. So that was kind of an interesting time. Now, to get back to the essence of your question, the real reason this treaty was important can be stated in 2 words, and that is strategic stability. in which two nations that have the ability to basically wipe each other out have to have the confidence that is very unlikely to happen. And what a more than anything else, what a START treaty would do is to put limits on the opposing side, which you outlined in the opening here, that would prevent one side from being able to break out and conduct a successful first strike on the other side, a preemptive first strike. And that's what we both worry about, and it's particularly what the Russians were worried about. And that guided us through how many warheads we thought we could get down to, because we, under the guidance of President Obama, we did want to reduce as many warheads as we could. Now, an interesting number there, we capped 1,550 deployed strategic warheads and 700 deployed delivery systems per side. And so what do those numbers mean? The deployed delivery systems is, how many warheads would count on a missile? How many warheads would count on a bomber? So a bomber would count as one deployed delivery system, but it could carry many different, strategic nuclear weapons. So there's kind of some complex math in there. But if you look at the actual numbers that the two sides were left with, Russia is still estimated to possess around 5,400 nuclear warheads, and the U.S. has 5,100, but they're not deployable. They're in storage, that sort of thing. So anyway, START treaty was troubled, particularly on the verification side, especially when COVID came along, and definitely when the Ukraine war came along. The Russians have sort of definitely cheated on it, but it's still better to have a START treaty than it is to not have a START treaty, and both sides have demonstrated a willingness to get to something else. Vladimir Putin offered to President Trump, we are told, the opportunity to extend START again, but the original treaty said it could only be extended once, and President Trump has said he wants a more comprehensive treaty negotiated with his experts. So
yeah, I don't think he wants to rely on something that was negotiated under Obama, because I think there's some political malaise there or whatever. But I think a great point that you brought up that I want to hammer is the fact that even though there were still over 5,000 nuclear warheads on either side, they were not deployable. They were in storage. And you talked about this when we were reviewing the House of Dynamite. To generate a bomber takes a while, and to even pull these nuclear warheads out of storage would take a while as well. That would be a very deliberate thing. It would probably be recognizable via intelligence collection, so you would know if they were ramping it up, which, then you can start to have diplomatic discussions to maybe cool the temperature down, get that, doomsday clock away from midnight. But with that being said, does this just completely open? I know it takes a while to build nuclear infrastructure, but I mean, they could pull more nuclear warheads out and have them more readily deployable. Does this build up a new arms race, or is this just kind of like, okay, status quo? You said the Russians were already cheating on it. Does it change anything in the near term? I mean, if we get a new START treaty in a year, is that going to be sufficient enough? Because there's not much that they could do in a year. Or like, how serious is it if we turn around and get a new deal relatively quickly?
I think it's costly and politically difficult, particularly in this country, to break out of a treaty limit, with new systems. We're refreshing existing systems, but within the bounds of the START treaty. To do something to break out of that would be very politically difficult and expensive. So I don't think you're going to see it on our side. I also not so sure you're going to see it on the Russian side either. Now, one thing to remember is that these were strategic nuclear weapons, long-range nuclear weapons. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, which governed shorter-range nuclear forces, was violated badly by the Russians and was basically negated by, I think, the Trump administration years ago, because we try as we might for years and years to get the Russians to back into adherence to that treaty. They just weren't doing it. So on shorter range systems, you may see some movement in that area. And in particular, there's discussion of reinvigorating the nuclear Tomahawk missile, which would be a very, very effective deterrent against Russia. And I actually argued for that a number of years ago with my co-author Jim Miller, that we should consider revitalizing the nuclear Tomahawk, because it's a very survivable system and there's really nothing the Russians can do about it if they want to continue to break out of the INF treaty.
Yeah, because you could put their tomahawks. You could fit a ton of them on top of or in an SSGN, right? We have the strategic boomers that have the larger nuclear, strategic level nuclear systems, but you could put a ton of those in SSGNs, or you could probably even put them. Granted, if I'm wrong, you could even put them in destroyers and cruisers and have them floating all across the world as a much more prevalent, I guess, and in-your-face deterrent to a country like Russia.
Yeah, I don't think I would put them on surface ships for a couple of reasons. One, candidly, surface ships are more vulnerable than submarines. Now, our submarines are so quiet, nobody's going to be able to touch them. And then you really get into some complex things with port visits into foreign countries when they don't want you coming into port with nuclear weapons on board and that sort of thing. So probably you won't see it on the big battleship that we talked about a couple of times ago.
So, do you think the reason why Trump did not accept the extension was primarily political because it was negotiated under? Or do you think that it's does he have advisors that are telling him, hey, there's massive increases in technology here that we need to keep into, or that we need to take into account, in negotiating a new start treaty, or because if that were the case, then it's kind of like, okay, why not just keep the existing treaty going for now while you negotiate those new limits if you want to make changes? Why do you think it was an abrupt, nope, we're done, I don't care about extending it for a year?
I think there are two reasons. The lesser important reason was political. He wants to put his own stamp on a treaty and not live with somebody else's, as you pointed out before. I think the much bigger reason is he wants to bring in China. And we have looked at this before. It's an incredibly difficult problem. Negotiating a nuclear agreement between two countries is difficult enough as it is. It took years to get New START done. To bring in a third country is almost impossible. And I've referred to it at the time, and I still do, as the three-body problem. There's a great science fiction novel written by a Chinese person, and I think there's a movie coming out, if it's not already out, called The Three-Body Problem, where if you are trying to do the differential equations for two bodies that are rotating around each other in space, that's fairly straightforward. As soon as you bring a third one in, it becomes an almost unsolvable problem, and that's kind of the way we are. And China has indicated that they don't want anything to do with the nuclear negotiation. Partly because their arsenal is smaller than either the Soviet or the Russians or the United States, and they would want to negotiate from a position of strength rather than from a position of weakness. So we'll see what happens. I don't know. I would assume there are experienced people on the Trump team who understand this, who know how hard it is, and it'll be interesting to see how this topic migrates over the coming year.
Real quick, what are some of those things that make a nuclear negotiation so difficult? I already mentioned a little bit about with China. They want to negotiate from a position of strength, but what are some of those other issues that come up?
Fundamental difficulty with nuclear weapons negotiations is something called trust. When it comes to nuclear weapons, you just don't trust the other side. And so you want to get as many...
It's the trust but verify from Reagan,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, exactly. And so you want to get as many intrusive, consistent verification measures in there as you can. And so there's sort of, when you're talking about them inspecting us, you want them to be able to inspect us, but you don't want them to be able to inspect too much. If they're looking at submarines to see how many nuclear weapons are on board, you don't want them to learn anything else about the submarines. And if they're overflying the United States with aircraft with cameras, which we used to do to each other, you don't want them photographing installations that have nothing to do with nuclear weapons. And I mean, it's just a whole host of trust issues, and in terms of how capable are they of hiding a breakout. So that is what makes it so hard. And then there's some calculations of, what would it take at this particular level of weapons for there to be a successful first strike and a residual second strike capability in your submarine force, all those sorts of things. And then another thing is, we believe in a triad, 3 legs of a triad. We have bombers, we have nuclear submarines, and we have intercontinental ballistic missiles that are based in silos. And the reasons we do that are because if one of those legs fails, for some strange reason, we find a component that's broken in the intercontinental ballistic missile system, and they're now all down well, you at least still want to retain the ability to have your nuclear deterrent with the other two legs, which means it needs to be bigger than most people, would, it's like, hey, we can blow up the world 5 times over. Well, what if, 4 of those 5 things go away? You still need to be able to deter your adversary.
And having it be survivable too. I mean, that's one of the largest reasons why we were taught at the Naval Academy, we have boomers, is that a first strike happens and they're able to take out some of those strategic capabilities, or you can't get a bomber generated in time to provide a credible deterrent. The Russians know that there are boomers located all across the world that are able to strike them and are not able to be found. I think it's one of the biggest things of this story, and then we'll get to the 2 other quick topics. But is the fact that this largely went under the radar. I don't think that many people knew that this thing expired unless you were tied into national security and the New START treaty itself, or you were in government. And I think it's a testament to the fact that there are so many other things happening in the media environment, particularly with certain files getting released, that it's just sweeping all of this very important news. Again, this is a story that's going to continue to evolve over the next few years, and is, frankly, as we've mentioned before when we talked about nuclear topics, frankly, probably the most important thing that the country or the president can do is negotiate something like this. But real quick, I want to dive in because we're getting close to the hour mark. Thoughts? Have you read at all about the 2 ships that collided? This is not the first time. It's almost like a broken record that 2 Navy ships are colliding again. What are your thoughts on that? It looked like it was an underway replenishment. I know you've done a lot of those in your time as captains of LPDs and carriers. What are your thoughts?
There are 3 or 4 things that can get a captain fired, and this is one of them. They expect you to not exchange paint with another ship. It's, underway replenishments are challenging evolutions. You have to prepare, you have to be trained, and you have to conduct them very carefully. And, you're basically pulling alongside another ship that's going probably 13 knots or around 15 to 16 miles per hour. And you are going to go within about 120 to 140 feet of that ship and drive alongside for hours while hoses and high tension wires are passed back and forth between the ships that come under tension, and they tend to want to pull the 2 ships together. There's a Venturi effect between the 2 ships, believe it or not, that actually tries to suck the ships together. So you have to really pay attention to what you're doing. And there's a conning officer and a helmsman and the captain, and everybody's watching very closely. It goes back to the operational excellence principles that we've talked about before, where you have to have people who are willing to have forceful backup, both to do forceful backup and to receive forceful backup if something's not going well, like somebody gives the wrong helm command, like a helm command towards the other ship rather than away from the other ship. And then complicating it all is if you're doing it at night, which is another level of difficulty, which we can do, or in very bad weather and rough seas. I can't imagine rough seas in the Caribbean right now, so I don't want to prejudge what happened. But I don't know of any or many examples of where a collision occurred that was not a human error. The one exception would be some sort of a steering casualty where a rudder goes where it's not supposed to go, that kind of thing. So, let's wait and see what the investigation says, but this is never a good thing. But fortunately, we only had a couple of people hurt and nobody badly injured.
Didn't lose any lives with the collision, and I watched the video. The seas didn't look necessarily that rough. I mean, I'm a Marine, so I'm a land guy, but I've been on ships. Didn't look like it was that rough. And I can tell you, it looks like the ships are slowly coming together, and then they finally hit. And I think that one of the largest thing that was commented on these social media posts, because everything now is on social media, was, wow, they had so much time. And I think it's a failure to understand that it takes some time to move these big beasts out of the way of one another. It doesn't just happen like you would in a car, but I would attribute it, it's kind of like you got 2 semi trucks that are driving, right next to you. You got to keep them right next to each other while you pass things back and forth. And, oh, by the way, there are, 20, 30, 40 mile an hour winds, crosswinds that are hitting the side of it. So being able to maintain that is very difficult. We're very good at it as a Navy, but unfortunately, accidents do happen. At least you're, and I didn't even think about that effect that would suck those 2 ships together. That's interesting. That's something I never thought of.
It's why after I'd say every underway replenishment that anybody ever does in the Navy, you rehearse what's called an emergency breakaway, because you have to be very, very proficient about untying those two ships and getting the heck out of the way. And I've had to actually do that for real when I was a captain of Enterprise and we were refueling alongside an oiler, and a merchant ship came in our direction and was going to, from way over the horizon, was on a collision course with us, and was not listening to the radio. The captain was, they were on autopilot or something like that, and we ended up having to do an emergency breakaway to get away from this rogue merchant ship, and fortunately that went very well.
Yeah, I think this is also anytime you deploy military forces anywhere in the world, mistakes should never happen, but they inevitably do. Operational mistakes do occur. We lost a Marine overboard this past week as well, and he was just declared dead. So these things happen, and I think that is again the calculus. Even if it is not to a combat operation, these things are inherently dangerous and risky. And so every time that a military force, be it a MU, be it a carrier strike group, gets deployed somewhere or surged somewhere, there are associated risks that are not always necessarily combat related that do need to be taken into account. Moving on, the last
just real quick, one of the things that I've said about leadership many times is leaders get hired to do really only a few things. One is provide vision and guidance to your organization. Another is to make sure you get the right team aboard, and the third is to handle the crisis.
Yeah.
And
handle risk. Yeah.
Because very often the leader's really the only one who knows everything that needs to be done and can remain calm and get the team through that crisis. So.
And the last thing that just recently happened, that the FAA, I think, closed El Paso airspace for 10 days and almost immediately reversed it. And it came out that it was cartel drones that were coming across the border to do something in the United States in our airspace. Two big things about this real quick. The first one is it was kind of interesting to me that it was going to be closed for and then it was immediately lifted. Things like that don't necessarily happen. Like if there was going to be a drone incident, why do 10 days? Why not just, close for the next 24 hours? The fact that they were able to get a notice out like that instead of just shutting down the airport. And then two, if it was actually cartel drones, I think this is just an emphasis of what we wrote about I think last summer, where drone warfare is going to come to the United States whether we like it or not. And I think that this is just a good example of that.
So this is, I haven't really deeply researched this incident, but there are a couple of things to me are pretty interesting. One, I had heard another story that it was because there was a drone exercise at Fort Bliss, which is right next to the El Paso airport. And that would make sense to me because Fort Bliss is where the Army does its air defense systems. So if you're going to test something, you might do it at Fort Bliss. And that there was a monumental breakdown in communications between the Pentagon and the FAA, which led to this closure. And somehow the story got out there that it was Mexican drones coming in, which sounds pretty good, but it may not actually be true. Because if I'm a Mexican cartel leader and I'm going to send drugs in via a UAS, I'm not going to do it in El Paso.
No. I'm going to do it in the middle of the desert. Yeah.
I'm going to do it in the middle of the desert and find some place where I can rendezvous with a pickup truck. So this is fishy. It's over. And what I'm really hoping is that the Army had a very successful counter-drone exercise and they learned something from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, because, again, social media, this big 10-day shutdown happens, and immediately everybody speculates, oh, well, it's because we're about to conduct a bunch of military operations against cartels into Mexico, which is definitely, has been in the news lately. And then it was, well, Mexican cartel drones are coming over. That was the last story that I read, is that, the Department of War said, well, it was Mexican cartel drones. And then I think you're probably closer to there. But I think it is the biggest lesson, again, is to not have a knee-jerk reaction. You can choose to just let things fall eventually and then come out with an opinion about what you think.
Two famous lines come to mind. It's like, keep moving. There's nothing going on here.
Yep.
And then the famous line from Star Wars is like, these are not the droids you're looking for.
Yep. These are not the drones you're looking for.
Looking for exactly.
Yeah, no, that's good. Well, yeah, great talk, Dad. I think it's very interesting. Last couple of weeks, like I mentioned at the top of the episode, we had taken a couple of weeks off. This is going to come out on Tuesday. I'm going to spend some time to edit it over the weekend, but expect episodes to continue to drop on Tuesday, and expect continued, written pieces to come out both on the weekend and elsewhere.
And something for our listeners to also look for, a shameless plug. We interviewed today our 70th episode of The Adrenaline Zone with race car driver Romain Grosjean, who's raced in F1, and he's going to be racing in IndyCar this year. And it was a fantastic interview. So look for that to come up in the next week, probably next Thursday, I think, is when it's going to hit the wires.
Will we see him in Washington, D.C. for the F1 race that's going to happen in our nation's capital?
No, because he's going to be racing in IndyCar this year.
Okay. Yeah. I am actually, of all the 250th things, I am very much looking forward to that race, although I will probably be in California and unable to attend. But if I was in D.C. or could be in D.C., I would absolutely try to get to that race.
One of the really fascinating things for me that came out of that interview that I never really realized was the dramatic differences between F1 and IndyCar racing. I thought they were just fast cars with a little bit of a difference, but they're dramatically different in how the whole thing works. It's I'm not going to spoil the podcast.
But I'm just going to go listen to the episode.
Yeah. Okay.
Awesome. Well, great episode. We'll see you again next Tuesday. I'm sure more stuff will happen between now and then. In the meantime, thank you so much to our paying subscribers who are making all of this possible, and we are going to continue to upgrade the experience and the content that we provide to you. But thank you for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time.